Thank you very much. I've worked as a diversity professional for the last 10 years, and I was one of the people standing up just now when I said that I thought my role wouldn't disappear within the next 10 years. In some respects, I hope it does, but I suspect I might be around for a while longer. I worked for nearly 7 years in the legal sector. Prior to that, I worked in a very different sector, which was the world of investment banking. And I don't offer a glittering magic wand today. If I could, I would be a very rich man and I probably could have retired. But I will share my thoughts and observations based on my experiences in the legal and the banking sector. Now, during my time, and most of you here today, I have seen and heard just about everything when it comes to diversity, not all of it positive. When I first moved into the diversity role at JP Morgan 10 years ago, some people thought I wasn't even a paid resource. They thought I was doing it voluntarily. And my role has shifted significantly in the last few years, and I think now that people accept that diversity professionals are kind of part and parcel of an organisation, but I don't think they're quite centre stage yet. I still feel slightly I'm in the long grass on the side, but not as bad as it was some years ago. I've seen progress though, and I think overall our approach to the subject has matured considerably, and that's been helped in some part by changes in societal attitudes and legislation. Now, it's not going to surprise you to know that I think that focus on diversity in the legal sector came relatively late in the day. I think historically we thought we were a meritocracy, and also we thought it's not something we need to focus on. At the end of the day, we're just delivering service to our clients. The Stonewall Workplace Equality Index, for those of you familiar with it, is not a totally defining measure in terms of how good an organisation is, but it is a useful barometer in sort of getting a sense of how well an organisation is doing, and more broadly a sector in the diversity space beyond LGBT diversity. It's not so long ago that not a single law firm featured in the top 100 firms in the Stonewall Index. This year, 2 law firms featured in the top 10, and 10% of firms overall were law firms. Now, in terms of policies, I would be amazed if organisations represented here today did not have a diversity or anti-harassment or dignity at work policy. We all have them, and one of the first things I did when I joined KWM in March was completely rewrite our policies and include specific examples of the type of behaviour that wasn't acceptable. The updated policy was communicated to all staff, but policies alone will mean very, very little unless they are linked to a much broader approach to diversity and that they are enforced. People in my experience are very sceptical of policies, and there's enough sceptics out there generally when it comes to diversity without combining the two. A policy is not going to change a culture, and a policy is not going to change your stats, but not having these kind of policies is something you ignore at your peril, particularly from a risk perspective. Now, the lack of diversity in leadership roles is a massive subject, and I could talk all day about that. It's something I hear a lot about, but I frequently ask people, what do we actually mean by the lack of diversity? You could go so far down the line that we almost go for the big brother approach to diversity, where you engineer so much diversity it just looks forced. Even if your partners are all white middle-aged men, who I think often and very unfairly get the blame for everything, you are still going to have diversity. Sure, we could do a better job of highlighting what diversity we have, but undoubtedly there is more we can do. But of course, what we really mean by lack of diversity in leadership roles is gender imbalance, and to a lesser extent, ethnicity. Now, to my mind, the outside lens is slightly over-obsessed with the diversity of our partnership and leadership roles. It seems to be the single statistic that everyone wants to know. And don't get me wrong, I'm not dismissing this as something that's not important, but I think we need to start these things much earlier and fix the pipeline first. For us in the legal sector, you're potentially looking at 14 years between when someone is offered a training contract and when they might make partner, and that's an awfully long time in 2015 to keep people. We also have to bear in mind that we make up relatively few partners in relation to our trainee numbers, and that means progress is going to be incredibly slow. For business services, we probably need to better define what leadership roles are. The complexity of business services roles and levels means we aren't always clear who is in a leadership role, but I think generally diversity is better than on the fee earning side, but not least because the career structure and opportunities are more fluid. But we also need to remind ourselves there are some things we can't change, some things we can change, or some things that are just generally very, very hard. And by trying to increase diversity in leadership roles, we sometimes have the additional challenge of managing societal issues as well. The biggest of these is families. Yes, it may be 2015, but women are by and large the default child and elder care provider in their families. And this does have an impact on the workplace. This isn't something we're likely to change, but we can better support our working parents, not just female working parents, I would add, but in particular, we can do a much better job, I think, of supporting our maternity populations. Most law firms offer some form of maternity coaching, but I would question if we're not trying to improve our pipeline why maternity coaching or support on some level isn't offered to all of our maternity populations. I don't know a single person that's gone through maternity coaching that hasn't found it hugely beneficial. Of course, you need to involve those people called line managers as well. Just like partners, they seem to get blamed for an awful lot of stuff. One of the things that we're looking at KWM currently is how we create better support networks for those with family or parental responsibilities. And also, we are, in terms of looking at mentoring and sponsorship programs, both of which we will introduce next year. But mentoring in particular needs to be introduced much earlier than it traditionally is. It's sometimes too late introducing a mentoring program for people who are 8 or 9 years qualified. Now, when I say we don't help ourselves, I mean the sector as a whole, not people in this room. On the fee earning side, we all know the career path is fairly inflexible, both in terms of the route to partnership and the options open to people when they don't make partner. And although this isn't going to change anytime soon, we need to do more to support flexible and part-time working. Generation Y expect it, and increasingly everyone else expects it too. And it's not going to be a massive surprise to anyone when I say I think as a sector we massively lag behind in this space. We have an obsession with inputs and not outputs. I still can't quite grasp why sometimes we only assess someone on their number of billable hours they put in. Now, I know a number of us are moving away from this, and I think long-term this is going to allow a fairer evaluation of an individual's contribution, and in turn it should make it a bit easier to increase diversity in leadership roles. I'll come back to that in a second. But we have to be open about how we measure performance and assess an individual's suitability for leadership roles. We can't blame the lack of diversity in leadership roles solely on families. Lack of credible role models and how people are assessed are important factors as well. And we could debate this subject for the rest of the day. On a slightly negative side, one of my personal frustrations is we allow sometimes individuals to be international spokespersons for their entire population. And all you need is 1 or 2 disgruntled individuals who perhaps haven't had their career expectations managed properly to go out and be a voice for the rest of the firm, often in a negative way. And this can have a huge impact on engagement and more broadly the culture. Now, how do we increase female representation in senior business services and partner roles? And I would have to ask the question, though, to start with, does anybody really care about diversity in business services? I don't ask that in a flippant way, but I think it's a question we have to ask ourselves. I've seen lots of client pitches over the years, but there is very rarely a question on the diversity of business services. Regulators are increasingly expected us to do more and more to open access to the professions. We all now are required to publish data online in line with our SRA obligations. But when we publish business services data, it's generally very, very high level. And is it more of an afterthought? As I said, I think there is good representation of female in business services, but without having the full stats and without having a more standardised reporting structure, it's very hard to say for certain. Having a greater gender balance of partners is probably everyone's single biggest issue. But there are lots of different ways on how we approach this. Lateral recruitment definitely needs to be more robust. One of the things we're looking at to do as KWM is whether it's actually possible to have an equal gender balance in terms of candidates for partner and senior roles. It could be, of course, that in certain situations the specialism is just with males, but equally the same could apply to females. But we also got to be realistic. Is it actually possible to have an equal candidate slate for partnership roles if perhaps we're all pitching from the same talent pool in the first place? One of the things I've done since I started at KWM is look at our trends in lateral partner hiring. And sometimes these decisions made in isolation look fine, but when you put them all together on a piece of paper, it's not perhaps the most balanced from a diversity perspective. And internally, we need to be more open-minded and definitely more challenging on who is put forward for partnership. Sure, most of us have committees which review the final candidates, but often it's too late by then. And one of our substantive challenges as a sector is that we need to move away from the notion that somehow someone who works part-time and has someone who has family commitments, that seems to be a barrier, that shouldn't be a barrier to making partner. And that thinking is something that's almost exclusively applied to women. I've yet to hear anyone say that a man isn't going to make partner because he's father of children. And one area that I genuinely am baffled at, and having worked in the legal sector for 7 years, I still don't get, is why there is a complete lack of transparency around which partners work part-time or even have formal flexible working arrangements. Surely this should be encouraged after all, because often I hear female associates in particular say it's not possible to have a family and make partner, but they need to see it can be done. I was struck only recently at KWM when I was in a meeting where some associates said that they weren't aware of any partners that work part-time, and one of the partners in the room said, but we have 2 in this department alone. And they genuinely looked stunned that they didn't know, and I have to ask, why is that the case? Of course, convincing some partners that this is all not going to have an impact on our clients is another conversation. But I've yet to hear a client say that someone working from home or someone working flexibly is an issue. Surely it's better to have 80% of a brilliant lawyer's time than none, if the net result means the individual is going to leave because we can't accommodate their request. But of course, that said, you can't accommodate every request. We still have a business to run. Targets are undoubtedly the hot topic of the moment. As we all know, Lord Davis recommended a few years ago that the UK should not have mandatory diversity targets. And through the work of the 30% Club and others, there has been a huge progress in getting the better representation of females on boards. But I haven't seen the same level of progress in terms of greater numbers of female partners in city law firms. A number of firms have published targets, some of them very challenging, and at KWM we're looking to do the same. I might be preaching to converted, but what's the alternative if we really want to increase the numbers? The banks have been focused on gender diversity for years, but this generally hasn't led to a change in the number of women in leadership roles or senior positions. And I'd have to ask people, what are people afraid of? Having published targets, it's surely a strong statement of intent that will have a greater impetus to move the needle forward. It also sends a much stronger message to our female associate population, which in turn will engage them. Now, of course, targets are not for everyone, and nobody wants to get a job or a promotion just to tick a box, but nobody is advocating yet a target of 50% female partners. And I think it's offensive to say that a target, because at the end of the day that is all it is, of a target of 30% of female partners somehow discriminates against men, when pretty much every firm in the room will have a higher proportion of trainees and a very healthy proportion of associates who are female. We can definitely change the composition of our committees, and we can change who our client relationship partners are, and we shouldn't be afraid to do so. I'm sometimes struck by the fact that we seem to be unable to move someone perhaps to a different client because they've always looked after that client. Or why can't we increase more women to manage key client relationships? Now, it's been suggested that we have, whether or not there should even be a target or a quota for senior leadership roles within law firms. And I've heard this said more than once that, the senior management are open to this, but of course, a vote would have to go to the partnership. And we can probably predict what the partnership vote would be, given the current composition of the partners. So what are other sectors doing? We're very different, I think, and we've heard this already, from some sectors, and particularly the banks and professional services firms. Yes, diversity has been a much stronger focus for a lot longer, particularly the banks who've had a US influence. And as I've said, it hasn't necessarily led to changes at the top. Being in the legal sector, it's not a massive surprise that we can just be a little bit risk adverse. But I think there is a difference between risk adverse with regard to our legal work and risk adverse as to how we manage our people and diversity programs. To me, maybe I'm looking at this too simply, but I don't think they're the same. One of the big differences, I think, between the banking sector and the legal sector is there is far greater transparency as to who is seen as top talent. We, as a sector, seem to struggle to identify top talent and seem to struggle even more as to how we manage conversations with those that aren't seen as top talent or unlikely to make partner. And Axel has mentioned about the decision-making, and I think one of the things that struck me from when I moved from the banking to the legal sector is just sometimes how long that decision-making process can be and how many people were involved. When I first started at Freshfields, I thought I was proposing something relatively simple, and someone said to me, no, you need to write a paper. And having come from Goldman Sachs, where you generally use PowerPoint, and you generally had to get the whole of what you were going to say on one line of each bullet, I found that slightly challenging, I will admit. Other sectors are far more comfortable, I think, also with having targeted initiatives for underrepresented populations. In my entire time in the legal sector, I have yet to witness a conversation when talking about a women's initiative where someone doesn't stand up and say, hang on, surely this is discriminating against men. And I would always refer people to the partner stats to kind of back up the point that possibly it's not. Other sectors, I think, are better at measurement too. That's not to say we don't measure stuff, but I think they're generally much better at it, and I think they do an awful lot more with their statistics, and they're less risk adverse with what they do with their statistics either. 9 years ago at Goldman Sachs, you could scan an employee's barcode when they attended a diversity event or training. And I think on that point, other sectors make no apology for mandating diversity training or similar. And all too often in the legal sector, I've heard, I don't think we can mandate attendance, just strongly encourage it. But the question I've got, if diversity is such a key business priority for all of our firms, why isn't it treated the same? So why not make it compulsory? After all, what's the difference between diversity training and money laundering training? There's still a huge risk if we get diversity wrong. Other sectors often link diversity and people objectives to annual appraisal discussions, and I think some of the law firms here today are already doing that. At Goldman Sachs in London, everyone had to do 2 hours of diversity-related activity per year. You see, the barcodes did come in handy for something. Now, some banks have gone down the route of linking progress on diversity to compensation for their senior managers. I think that would be incredibly difficult for us to do. But surely linking diversity and people activity to annual appraisal discussions and performance discussions just makes sense. And I think other sectors are not afraid to name and shame. At JP Morgan, where I worked before Goldman Sachs, and at Goldman Sachs, it wouldn't be unheard of to publish league tables as to which departments had not done their mandatory diversity training. And I know of one bank that even stopped security passes for those people who hadn't done the diversity training. Yes, it might be a heavy-armed tactic, but it worked. Now, you might be thinking, hang on a minute, this is all a bit extreme. But if we're serious about diversity, why is it really extreme? It shouldn't be treated any differently to any other aspect of our business. Other sectors, I think, have tended to invest a bit more heavily in diversity, both in terms of resource and finance. And it's not always about throwing the cash at stuff, but sometimes you just need to do it. Since joining KWM, I've done a complete root and branch review of all what we spent on diversity to date, and where necessary, change that to ensure we're getting maximum return on investment, but also increasing it where we need to. And another area that I think is coming up on the rails in the legal sector is management, accountability and ownership. The banks are very, very strong on this, and one of the reasons I joined Goldman Sachs, initially only for a month but ended up staying 2 years, was because they were introducing diversity scorecards for their most senior managers in Europe, and that was in 2006. At KWM, we're in the process of creating a new diversity committee, which is going to be chaired by Stephen Conn, our senior partner. And the committee will report to the board and will be accountable. And I think it's also important that we remember that we will need other priorities just than gender, and I'll come on to that as to why in a second. Now, some of the stuff I've already mentioned we can't do much about, some of the stuff we can, but I think employee engagement is definitely the thing we can control. One of Stonewall's straplines is that people perform better when they can be themselves, but they also perform better when they're engaged. None of the firms here today intentionally try and make life difficult for themselves or intentionally create a culture where diversity doesn't thrive. Most people, when starting a new job, join an organisation, yet most people, when they leave an organisation, do so because of their own micro circumstances. The thing I hear most often is that people don't feel appreciated. And I don't necessarily mean from a financial perspective at all, but particularly if they've worked a lot of extra hours, sometimes that's barely acknowledged or even expected. In my role, I'm lucky enough to be trusted that if I put in a stack of extra hours, I can take a little bit back where I can. Others do the same, or their line manager encourages them to do so. But of course, some line managers don't mention this, and some employees don't feel able to have that conversation. And then, Houston, we do have a problem. But you have to ask what's in it for the employee. I would consider the highlight of my career was helping manage the 2014 and 2015 2015 Stonewall Index submissions when I was at Freshfields. A placing in the top 100 last year, the first and only Magic Circle firm to achieve that, and a top 10 placing this year was a culmination of years of effort. From senior management team down to individuals who made up the LGBT network, the success of that was in a large part down to having a very engaged network. But the network only became engaged when individuals realised the firm was taking the issue and them seriously, and that senior managers were actively and visibly supportive, and that support was genuine. And I think that is a real point of difference. The difference in the network was transformation, and this approach showed without doubt that there are huge benefits to employee engagement and can reap rewards for both firms and individuals alike. When I was working with the London 2012 diversity team, I was struck by, on many levels, by the sheer bureaucracy and the scale of what they were trying to achieve. But I was also struck by how they were trying to create the best possible experience for all those visiting the games. Individual contributions and recognising those contributions, though, are incredibly important. You can't really expect people to do stuff if it doesn't count for something. And you can't expect someone to do something that is going to benefit for the firm for nothing either. We're looking to introduce appraisal objectives next year that reflect an individual's commitment in this area and the broader CR area too. And launching our annual employee engagement survey next year will give us incredible metrics in which we can measure progress. If diversity is a top priority for our firms, why shouldn't someone's contributions in this space be acknowledged and count? When I started at KWM, I had a lot of meetings as part of my induction, but I also made a deliberate attempt to meet with lots of people at different levels and every department who weren't on my formal induction schedule. And those findings helped inform a paper I wrote for the board, which will shape our priorities for the next 12 months. But of course, it's the smallest things that make a difference. Whether it's an email about the importance of Ramadan, different themed menu in the restaurant, or simply showing support can bring huge rewards, and it's not difficult to do. I remember one of the things I was most surprised at during my time at Freshfields, and something I will replicate at KWM in 2016, is that 2 years ago we introduced a very, very small but very simple desktop calendar which highlighted all the main religious and cultural festivals that year. I had no expectations to whether people would use it, but people did. And I had so many emails saying it was amazing and it was brilliant, and it was the fact that the firm was showing they cared about this stuff was really encouraging. One point I would add, and I'm as guilty as anyone of this, because sometimes in my role you get sucked up in terms of what the external lens wants you to do. But the importance of gauging business services people, as we've already heard earlier, is critical, but it's often one that gets overlooked. I've questioned time and time again, not just at the firms I've worked at, but firms where my colleagues work at, is why when you have an event, is it exclusively only for fee earners? Unless it's so specific, there is no point in business services people being there. Now, as I said at the beginning, in 10 years' time, I would like to think that we've all progressed so much that my role is either non-existent or it looks very, very different to what it does now. But in conclusion, I want to make a couple of points. We have to be honest about the areas we can do better in, but we shouldn't be afraid to remind people of what we're good at too. And I think a lot of people forget that it's not just about remuneration at the end of the day. We are by no means the worst sector when it comes to diversity, trust me. We've made substantive progress in a very short time, and I wouldn't work for a firm or even work in a sector that didn't believe in it. 40 years after the Equal Pay Act was introduced, we are still grappling with the issue of equal pay. If we came back here in 40 years' time, I would like to think I would be long retired. But the demographics of our partnership will look very different in 40 years' time. They have to. We can't beat ourselves up, though, either. Change can be slow, lack of change can be frustrating, and we cannot fix everything at once. And we have to remember that. The best thing about the legal sector, though, as I was just saying earlier, is our thoughtfulness. And when we do something well, it's genuine. I don't think any law firm pays lip service to diversity. And yes, we should all challenge more. And I think we should particularly challenge some of the decisions that the partners make, or the fact that we allow sometimes partners just to get away with something because it's whoever it is, or they've been there a long time, or they might bring in a lot of money. But we must acknowledge our achievements too, particularly in the social mobility and LGBT space, for so long two of our Achilles' heels. Gender diversity, though, is going to take just a little bit longer. Thank you very much.